Welcome to Chapter 7.4, Economic Recovery, which sparked change during the Middle Ages. New farming methods started a series of changes in medieval Europe. By the 800s, farmers were using an iron plow instead of a wooden one, and horses rather than the slower oxen. Also, a new crop rotation system improved soil fertility. These changes helped farmers produce more food, and Europe's population nearly tripled between 1000 and 1300. In the 1100s, trade improved, and warfare declined. Demand for goods increased, and trade routes expanded. Trade centers arose along the routes and slowly grew into the first medieval cities. Merchants in such towns would ask the local lord or king for a charter. This was a document that established rights and privileges for those in the town in exchange for large sums of money, or a yearly fee, or both. As trade expanded, new business practices arose, and the need for capital or money investments stimulated the growth of banks. In addition, merchants sometimes joined together in partnerships, pooling their money to finance large-scale ventures. Other business changes included the development of insurance and the use of credit rather than cash, which allowed merchants to travel without having to carry a lot of gold with them. Overall, however, the use of money increased, and peasants began selling their goods to townspeople for cash. Also, by the 1300s, most peasants were hired laborers, or tenant farmers, paying rent for their land. By 1000, merchant traders and artisans had become a powerful social class between the nobles and the peasants. This was called the middle class, and the members of this class formed guilds. Guilds are associations which controlled and protected specific trades or businesses. To become a guild member, people often began in early childhood as an apprentice. After 7 years, an apprentice became a journeyman, or a salaried worker. Few became guild masters. Unlike other areas of medieval life, women dominated some trades and even had their own guilds. Towns and cities expanded rapidly during the medieval times. Typical cities were overcrowded, with narrow streets, multi-storied houses, no garbage or sewage system, and they were fire hazards, and they were a breeding ground for disease. In the early Middle Ages, it's good to remember that the people who were settling in and around what had been the Roman Empire were adopting new technologies and ideas from the Romans, and the Romans had been using a plow that was very light and would basically just scratch the surface, because in the Mediterranean, it's not a wet or heavy soil, it's a very light soil, and so you only need a small plow. Well, in the northern European countries, there was a need for a heavier plow that would dig in deeper, because you need to aerate the soil. Otherwise, if you put your seeds into the ground, they would rot because of the water content of the soil. So they would use a very heavy plow, which would mean that they needed a lot of force to drag the plow, because it was a very heavy plow. So they would usually use teams of oxen. And oxen are built with their heads kind of down like this. This yoked oxen over here. And they adopted this iron plow around 800, about the same time that Charlemagne was expanding his empire. And this enabled the northern European countries to be able to produce more grain. But oxen are very slow, and they eat a lot, and they are only useful for that one task on the farm, plowing. So what do you do with oxen for the rest of the time that you have them? So they weren't the most useful farm animal. Well, then came a transformation, or an invention that helped to transform plowing again. It enabled them to use a farm animal, the horse, for multiple purposes. And horse, of course, if you put a horse in a harness like this, it would choke the horse because they're built differently. Their heads are up higher, and it would, so they needed a new type of plow, of harness. But if you use a simple leather harness like this, you will get very little horsepower out of them because they're pulling with their, basically just the front end. But through the work of monasteries, they were able to create a horse collar that wrapped around the neck of the horse but didn't choke the horse, and using all of the different connector points, they were able to multiply the force that a horse could use to drag a heavy plow. And so this enabled them to transform their farming system. Lords also wanted to utilize all of what they considered to be wasted land, and so they started to clear more territories. And in fact, if you go to Europe today, all of the virgin forests have been cleared by this point, by modern days. But during this point, during the Middle Ages, there were still huge tracts of forests that had never been cut down. It was still wilderness to some extent. So they would send out teams of peasants to go out and clear the land. And land that has just recently been cleared is often much more fertile than land that has been cleared for quite some time. And because it has more nutrients in it. They would also use a system called the three crop rotation, or the 3-field system, and that was where they would divide a field into 3 portions, and they would leave one portion fallow, which means they did not plant anything on that part of the field, but the other 2 portions, one would be grain and the other one would be something called légumes, which is a French term that means the bean family, or the family of plants that produces protein-rich food. And so peasants would be able to use this as their protein source, and so it was a good system because not only that, but legumes are well known for putting back into the soil nitrogen and other nutrients that other plants need in order to cause healthy growth. So it was a symbiotic relationship, and it was much better using a 3-field system than trying to do it as a 2-field system, because more land was able to be used each year with only not using one smaller field. Well, after the 900s, the Vikings had come, and many of them settled down and started to create kingdoms or territories of their own, and there was a kind of a rest from invaders, and it caused the more stability in Europe, and then more trade and travel was possible. And so the middle of the Middle Ages was a time known for its increase in trade and travel. Those with money, like noblemen, were interested in products that their manors could not produce, like silk or gold or other precious things. And peasants wanted iron for iron tools so that they could do their jobs better. So all of these things needed to be traded with the outside world. And many of those things came from Asia and other parts of Europe. Some adventurers realized that there was money to be made in trade, and so they were willing to take the risk of the traveling and the investing of their money and resources in order to make money in trade. They would often form groups that could travel together in order to provide safety, and these became known as caravans. One of these trade companies or associations was named the Hanseatic League, and it was a league of northern European cities that got together and decided that they would protect one another's trade and exclude other cities or other traders that were working independently, and they made a lot of money doing that. And they were able to. This is actually going to cause some social upheavals in the near future. But the Hanseatic League was known for trading fish, dried fish, and silks and gold and spices and other products. The Hanseatic League actually lasted for about 150 years, and it took actions to reduce the problem of pirates and robbers, and it built lighthouses, and it trained ship pilots, and it made trade much more abundant during this time. Well, trade was really dependent on the weather in the Middle Ages. When it was nice weather, people would travel and trade, and when it was wintertime, they would often hunker down and work on creating the products that they would later sell. So these areas where these traders settled down and started and had their workshops, these grew into towns, and towns could have up to 10,000 people living together, producing crafts and for trade for later in the year. Some of these most well-developed towns, going up to populations of almost 100,000, some of them, were mainly found in northern Italy, Florence and Venice, and also in northern Europe there were a few, some like Flanders, which was actually not northern Europe, but in the Netherlands, Flanders. So in northern Europe, the trade usually, one of the most prominent things traded was wool. And in southern cities like Florence, the trade was kind of like a conduit from the Mediterranean or Eastern Mediterranean. So silks and spices would be siphoned through these lower cities. Most cities had a charter, which is basically an agreement between the population of the city or the leaders of the city and the lord who owned that territory or who ruled the territory. And basically it was an agreement that the lord would turn his eye and not be too greedy or not try to dominate politically, and in return the citizens of the town would pay him a hefty sum in order for them to have considerable amounts of freedom. One of the big things in charters that was often found by historians is that runaways could find freedom in a town if they managed to stay free for a year and a day. The use of money is actually a fairly sophisticated idea because it's expecting that a piece of gold carries a value or piece of metal carries a value, and then you can trade that theoretical value of that coin or that piece of metal for another object that you can actually use. So it's actually a fairly complicated theoretical idea, but it was widely used during the early Middle Ages. And an even bigger jump would be the idea of using credit, which is theoretical money that you would use to buy products that you would then pay back the person that you bought those products with that theoretical money. That's not complicated at all, is it? So with the new political freedoms that people were experiencing in towns, they were also experimenting with economic freedom. They were discovering that if you wanted to make money, you kind of had to risk. If you risk too much, you could be completely destroyed. So they would try to break up the risk into smaller, manageable sizes. And they would do this by forming a partnerships that would share the risk of a business venture and make it so that if the business venture failed, then the person who had helped to give money to that venture would not be completely destroyed. The idea of risking money in order to make money was a really avant-garde idea, because the church had frowned upon that kind of money making for centuries. They would call this usury, which is would have been quite a big sin that you would have to do penance for in the Middle Ages. But the church was relaxing its hold on that aspect of the economy, and so people were experimenting with using money to make money. Money could be also called capital in this regard, because you're investing capital in a business venture in order to make more money. Another option would possibly be, let's say you are a business person and you don't necessarily want to share the profits of your business, but you do want some protection in case something happens. So you could buy insurance on your endeavor. And so if it did fail, then another company that was selling you insurance would pay the cost of the failure. But the only thing you would be out of would be the cost of the payment for the insurance. So this was another a little bit more elaborate form of breaking down the liability of investment. And this was another option. If you were traveling from one place to another, and it's dangerous to travel with a lot of gold upon you, you could actually, they had figured out that they had made agreements between people within different cities that if you could put your money into, or you could give it to the one person in one city, and they would give you a bill of credit, or they would give you a paper that said that you had given them this much money. Then you could take just that paper to the next city and give it to the other person and say, this in the other town I gave them this much money, and then you would pass on that piece of paper and you would get that much money in return for that piece of paper. So they had agreements worked out so that people who traveled between cities didn't have to travel with much money on them. And it was a brilliant idea. It helped to protect traders from bandits and robbers. So this was kind of the birth of the idea of a banking system, and it helped to also to protect merchants from bad luck or misfortune. Another word for a company that divides up the risk of a venture would be a joint stock company. These new ideas were basically an economic revolution, because it changed the society from being a rural agricultural bartering economy where where very little money was exchanged between people, to becoming a much more developed economy where money was frequently exchanged, and goods and services were bought and sold much more easily and frequently. And with the amount of money being circulated, there was more money available for the poorer tenant farmers, and they would much prefer to pay their lord with money rather than with labor, because their labor, some of them, their labor was worth a lot, especially if they had a skill. Let's say they were a blacksmith or a seamstress or something like that. Their labor, they could get more money by doing their craft than by working in the fields for the Lord. So they would much prefer to work at their craft and then pay the Lord a sum for their land usage. By the year 1000, the old feudal pyramid with only a few special classes had kind of become defunct. It was so yesterday. So there was a new class being formed, and this was the middle class. This was the people who were merchants and who were using money to their advantage. They were experimenting with the freedom that they had been gaining from the Lord in towns and through other means. Of course, noblemen and clergy actually quite despised the middle class, because they were outside of their control and they were flouting the generally agreed upon norms of that time period. So they were not well liked by the original aristocracy or the clergymen. Though towns were not under the jurisdiction of lords, they were by no means without laws. In fact, they had lots of laws, and most of those laws were created by guilds. Guilds were associations of merchants or people or craftsmen who had the same craft and got together and decided what rules would govern the creation of their products. The main interest of guilds was to try to protect the people producing those goods, and so they had rules like how many hours you had to spend per item, and how many sometimes even as nitpicky as how many stitches you were going to put in this pair of shoes, or how heavy a plow thing needed to be. They were very particular about the way something was produced and how the person was going to do that producing. So and the main reason for all of those rules was they wanted to weed out competition. If you make rules about exactly how something is going to be produced, that means there's not a lot of ingenuity, and you're not trying to undercut anyone else by charging less or making a better product. So everybody gets the same equal amount of business. That was basically the goal of a guild. It really was kind of socialistic, because guilds also, though they cut out the competition, they also tried to protect their guild members by providing for the other basic needs that they had. Let's say your husband was part of a guild and he gets killed, and you would be given a stipend because he was a member of that guild to help provide for you as a widow. There were all kinds of things like this. So let's say you got sick. Well, you were given some extra money to help with you while you were sick. So in some ways, it helped to cushion some of the bad things that could happen to people in guilds. Becoming a guild member, though, was extremely difficult. Families often tried to set their children up so that they could eventually join a guild, and then they would be protected for life, basically. So to start out with, your mother or father would have gotten an apprenticeship for you. And oftentimes they had to buy an apprenticeship. You paid a guild master money in order to teach that child the skill that the master was good at. And so then you would go to the master's house, and you would be there from the age of 7, probably, learning your trade. And you would work without any pay for the master, and in return, it had that similar feeling to feudalism, because there was obligations. So the family would give the child to the master to be an apprentice, and in return, the master would teach the apprentice the skills, and would feed the apprentice, and would make sure that his physical needs were taken care of. So there was a mutual obligation in regards to the apprenticeship program. However, eventually the apprentice would create a masterpiece or something, a product that was up to the master's standards, and then they would basically graduate to becoming a journeyman. A journeyman was a worker who could get a wage for his work, but was not a master. And eventually, when you had created a piece that was considered your masterpiece, then you would be upgraded to becoming and if it was accepted by other members of the guild, then you could become a master in that guild. Well, what was town life like in the early Middle Ages? And I think many movies try to depict this, and they're probably fairly accurate. It was, if I could think of 3 adjectives, I think they would be cramped, crowded, and unsanitary. because people were smushed together in a very small area with very little understanding of the necessity for hygiene. And so it was, in some ways, quite a dangerous place to live in regards to your health. And possibly in regards to pickpocketing and other things like that. Early medieval towns were usually surrounded by a very tall wall. They had to be protected from, oftentimes from lords who were trying to extort money from the citizens of that town. So the townspeople would often build high walls to protect them from a lord that was trying to gain power over them. They were also usually had a church in the center, on the center square. It showed the centrality of God in the medieval mindset and the need to have worship as part of their daily life. And the churches often had a really tall church tower that would help them to defend, because it enabled them to see the enemy from a long ways away. And it was also a warning system, because church bells were used to announce events that were possibly happening or would happen in the future. Finally, towns became kind of centers for the trade networks. So, they were the beginning of modern cities. So some of the towns that were begun during this time period eventually become great cities that we can go visit today in Europe.